And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted an API that could dramatically simplify the process of writing Drupal unit tests? There's a module for that. It's called Test Helpers, and it was created in September of 2022 by today's guest, Alex Koropov. It has a 1.3.0 version available, which is compatible with versions of Drupal 9.5, 9.4 or newer, right up to Drupal 11. It is actively maintained. In fact, that latest release was less than 3 months ago, and also has security coverage and test coverage, which would be ironic if it didn't. As far as documentation, it does have API documentation linked from the project page. And it has on the project page, as of today, 2 open issues. And they're both officially listed as bugs, but actually fixed at this point, and so will be addressed in an upcoming release. Drupal.org lists it as having 5 sites using the module, but modules or sites can leverage test helpers without enabling it, and this usage is recommended, so that number is actually higher. Now, the test helpers module provides a new container that automated tests can leverage to perform common tasks with much less code. For example, you can create a user or a node with a single line of code in your test, and you can also mock more complex operations like an entity query or load multiple call, again with a single line of code. Traditionally, writing unit tests is more complicated because by design they run without fully bootstrapping Drupal, and that means that your test needs to mock functions or services in the code you are testing, which can result in unit tests being much longer than the code they are written to test. Test Helpers also allows your test to leverage existing mocks and stubs for popular services, and the project page also links to the recording and slides for a talk Alex gave about Test Helpers at DrupalCon Pittsburgh last year if you want to do a deeper dive. So let's talk about Test Helpers.
I love these types of utility modules. I think it's something I've been thinking, the usage statistics is something I've been thinking about recently because the book module is being deprecated due to its low usage. And so there's been a little bit of discussion about how to measure that. And I'm curious about measuring adoption for a project like this because, like you said, it's kind of like the coder module or a lot of these other ones where like you're supposed to use it, but never on a production site. So it really is not going to report the number of sites using it. But anything that makes testing easier is a huge one in my book.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I definitely would say for the projects that I maintain that getting higher test coverage is certainly one of my priorities for 2024. So I was really happy when I found this as we were getting ready for this show. I was just going to ask Alex, what inspired you to create the module in the first place?
I think the pain of writing unit tests because when I joined to a project with a lot of unit tests already written, and when I change 1 or 2 lines in the code, a lot of tests start failing. So I started to think about how to simplify the tests because actually the tests are 10 times the tests have 10 times more lines than actual code, and in many tests you do the same things. For example, marking the entity query, marking the entity storage, and I started to create traits or reusable libraries inside the project to simplify the things. And then I looked into this and decided why to not create a universal module that can be reused in other projects. And then I started to use the same module on 2 projects, on 3 projects, and then decided, okay, let's be an open source module because it really simplified things on all our projects. And before it was like 1 day for write the business logic and 3 or 4 days to cover it by unit tests. And this module actually reversed this to writing code and spend less time to covering it by unit tests. And it makes the unit tests more like functional tests because you don't need to mock all the Drupal core functionality that we already know how it works and how it what we can expect in it.
I'm curious if it helps with mocking your own custom services when you inject them in another service, because that's also the kind of thing that takes a lot of effort, right? When you have to create kind of your own mocks for things. I mean, I don't think you obviously you can't shortcut kind of the logic of that service because it's a custom service, right? So you I don't think
Um,
there's any way to shortcut that, but there's a lot of still boilerplate when you're mocking a custom service as well. Does this have any helpers with that too, or is that no?
Actually, yes. You create just a mock of your service, or you can even initialize your service without mocking. So if it require, for example, entity storage for user and for nodes, you can just initiate it inside your unit test. So you will have a
Hmm.
full instance of your service, not the mock of it. Uh,
Oh,
and it will work like you write a functional test, but will work in a unit test context with
hmm.
very high speed of execution.
That that makes me very happy. Because I have a particular client in mind that I've been thinking about. We've been discussing at a high level implementing some tests, but they have some really complex service layers. So this might actually simplify quite a bit. I have one final question before we
Mhm.
move on, because there's a new change coming in core. Actually, it just landed in core yesterday that might affect a lot of
Well,
tests that you might want to be aware of. And that is because of the new access policy work that Christian's been working on. They've removed the super user one functionality. So user one used to be like the super user that could do anything, and so they
mhm.
removed that functionality. User one no longer has special functionality. My
Well,
understanding is there's a new temporary trait or setting, so you can say, "Hey, this test uses super user," because a lot of tests failed when they removed that. So as a kind of a temporary workaround, but I think it's going to shake up contrib quite a bit because by default it's going to be off. So if you weren't aware of that, you want to be aware of it because I imagine it's something you're going to want to support since this targets contrib.
interesting news, but I think it mostly depends, affects functional testing, but not unit test, because for unit test you can
Yeah,
create a user with any. But in functional test you also can create user with admin privileges, so it should not be a large problem. But maybe yes, some tests will fail and you will have to rewrite them to adapt to the new change.
I think the main issue is that most tests, not just contrib, because core had the same issue, is they would create a user and then run a test, and because that user was user one, it had all the permissions, and they weren't defining the permissions. After this change, creating that user no longer has those special permissions, so you have to explicitly define what permissions it should be testing. So if your module provides a permission, those types of tests are probably going to fail now because it's no longer super user one.
As I remember, we can use some function like give admin privileges to the user, so we can create a user and just add one more line to give it
Yeah,
privileges. So yeah, just just a simple change in a lot of
yeah,
files.
yeah. I think that's what's happening. So, well, thanks, Martin. And if folks have any suggestions for future modules of the week, what's the best way for them to provide you with those suggestions?
Well, our listeners have actually been doing a great job of providing us nominations, so I certainly hope they'll keep those coming. And happy to receive those in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or they can message me directly as ManClue in all the Drupal and social channels.